In this devotion, we're going to do a quick review of the book of Judges. It's a set of stories which should always come with a disclaimer. It is not rated PG. It is violent, ugly, bloody, sinful stuff. If it was a made-for-TV movie, it would start with a black screen that says viewer discretion is advised. Now, if you recall last time we looked at the book of Joshua and how it ended a lot like the book of Deuteronomy, a godly leader exhorting the people to faithfully live out their calling as God's covenant people. The nation of Israel was to be different than the surrounding nations. They were to be a kind of light in the world, showing what a covenant relationship with the Creator God should look like. So Joshua's life ends with that stirring sermon, right? Choose this day whom you'll serve, whether you're going to serve the gods of Egypt where you were enslaved, the gods of your enemies in the land of Canaan. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. And the people responded, God forbid that we should forsake Yahweh to serve other gods. Well, forbid indeed. Joshua dies, and now no new leader is appointed. The nation is to be a theocracy. Right, a nation that's ruled, living under the rule of God. But Judges is going to take up the theme of Joshua's sermon and show how Israel continually and consistently failed. Now here's how it breaks down. Judges 1 and 2 serves as an introduction. Actually, to be fair, the first 26 verses sounds promising, but then the remainder of Judges chapter 1 starts listing all the Canaanite tribes which were not removed from the land. And because there's so many Canaanite people that remain in the land, their false worship also remains in the land. There's graven images that were popular, these false gods, even child sacrifice was common. That plague cannot live in a nation and the society remain unaffected. So Judges 2 introduces a cycle, and it's a downward spiral that serves as a kind of repeated outline for the book. Now, there's a lot of ways to outline that cycle, but sort of a classic alliterative approach would be something like this. The people stop serving the Lord, and they fall into the sins of selfishness and idolatry and whatever other evil influence the Canaanites had brought upon them. And as a result, God would allow some surrounding nation to rise up and enslave Israel, putting them in servitude. The judgment would become so severe, the oppression so severe, that the people, apparently seeing the error of their ways, would call out to Yahweh in supplication. They would beg for deliverance. And God would answer, raising up some judge, not a courtroom judge, but some sort of a leader, whom God would use to bring salvation from that slavery and ultimately restore them to serving God again. But soon, that never-ending downward spiral begins yet again. That cycle, described in Judges 2, is an outline for what follows. Chapters 3 through 16 record the story of some of those judges. Those leaders God used as deliverers. Some are told in great detail, others are not. For example, everyone's favorite judge, I'm sure, is Shamgar. His story is told in a single verse, right? It says, and after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. Thus ends the story of Shamgar. Right? That kind of thing, telling a story in one verse, lets us know that the writer is being deliberate about what he's including in the book. He knows more, doubtlessly knows more, but he's limiting the information. The stories of 6 judges are told in most detail because the writer seems to show that this is a good example of this downward spiral. And so the first 3 aren't too bad. You have the story of Othniel, who is a nephew to Caleb, one of the 2 faithful spies. Then Ehud, who God uses to deliver the nation from the Moabites. And then Deborah, the only female deliverer, a judge who herself was a kind of judgment on the the wicked and fearful men who were failing as leaders. All three of them are relatively good, and we don't see a lot to criticize there, but as I said, you do see how the cycle continues in this downward spiral, and the other three judges whose stories are told in detail show that. Gideon, in chapters 6 through 8, is a coward of a man, constantly testing God, and he has a nasty temper. He murders people who he gets mad at. His life ends with him building an idol which is left behind for people to worship. Jephthah, who is the subject of a lot of debate, and you think about this man, he's a deliverer. Judges 11 introduces him as a mighty warrior, but he is the fatherless son of a prostitute who's living out in the countryside with a bunch of outlaws. Now, I'm not going to enter into the debate here about whether Jephthah actually sacrificed his daughter, but let me point out, just the fact that we think that's even possible should tell us what corruption Israel has fallen into. He makes this bargaining kind of vow with the Lord as if Yahweh is no better than a Canaanite god. And so there's all this manipulation taking place. Gideon hopes to manipulate God into proving to himself that he really is God. And Jephthah thinks he's going to manipulate God into giving him the victory by offering to sacrifice whatever first comes out of his house. And then Samson, the third of those final judges, whose story is probably the most known, had such disregard for Yahweh that he's a drunken womanizer who chases after foreign women. His own life becomes a downward spiral. As my friend Andrew Watkins noted, his spiritual blindness becomes physical blindness, as the final sight of his life was probably the evil temptress Delilah betraying him right before his eyes get put out. The greatest victory of Samson was his ultimate defeat, an act of defiance that brings down a stadium full of Philistines, leading to his own death as well as theirs. The point is, these are hardly heroes. The character of humanity is on display in this book. We have the depravity of an entire nation exhibited repeatedly, and the depravity of the judges themselves is only overcome as briefly as the Spirit of God moves in them to these mighty acts of deliverance, but it's not their own strength. If you want to see their own strength, go to the end of Judges 16 and read about Samson after, as verse 20 says, the Lord was departed from him. So those chapters tell the story of the judges, and then the final chapters of the book stop telling the story of judges and start describing the spiritual state of the nation, the fall of society as a whole. Judges 17 through 21 consists of two horrendous accounts. The first, a man named Micah makes his own idol to worship. He hires a Levite as a personal priest, and the Levite is happy to sell himself that way. And then when a bunch of soldiers from the tribe of Dan are looking for land because they hadn't done what God had commanded them and pushed the Canaanites out, this Levite blesses them in the name of Yahweh even as they go about slaughtering an innocent city. They're living in a society that cares nothing about true righteousness, but only personal expedience and strength, right? Might makes right. That's the society that they live in. And the final story is the worst of them all. There's a couple traveling through the countryside, and they're fearful of staying in a Jebusite city, right? There shouldn't be any Jebusite cities in the countryside, but they pass one and they're afraid to stay there. So they travel on toward an Israelite city, which should have been more hospitable, but instead it's more hostile. There's a rape and a murder and the victim's body being cut up into 12 pieces and sent out to all the tribes of Israel in protest. It leads to the first civil war in Israel. And as horrific as all that is, the message really seems to be a social commentary. Israel has fallen so far that when we go back through that story and think of where the mistake was, we think, Well, they should have stayed in the pagan Jebusite city instead of trusting the people of God. And that, simply said, is the theme of the book. It appears God's illustrating what's going to happen to Israel and to humanity as a whole when it rejects and rebels against his leadership. In fact, make no mistake, this was to be a theocracy, a nation ruled by God. When the people tried to make Gideon into a king, here was his answer in Judges 8. The men of Israel said unto Gideon, You rule over us, both you and your son's son also, for you have delivered us from the land of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So the nation was to live in this covenant relationship with Yahweh under his kingship. But they had rebelled and submitted to no authority except their own minds. And so Judges shows how that system, being ruled by our own hearts and by our own consciences, is a downward cycle. By the end of those stories in Judges 17 through 21, the people are no better. In fact, they are demonstrably worse than the heathen godless nations surrounding them. So the writer of Judges brings up this question of leadership throughout those final stories, those final examples. In Judges 17:6, he says, In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did what was right in his own eyes. In chapter 18, in those days there was no king in Israel. In chapter 19, it came to pass when there was no king in Israel. So whoever wrote the book of Judges, and I think probably it's the prophet Samuel, he studied this roughly 300 years of history, and he's carefully chosen examples, and he's making a point. The lack of submission to the leadership of God has consistently led the nation into sin and judgment. And so he keeps using that phrase, there was no king in Israel, to start a new story of failure. But then when he gets to the end of the book, oddly, the very last verse is the same phrase he's been using to start stories before. Judges 21 verse 25 is the last verse. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. When you read Judges, you get used to something coming after that phrase. But here it is, it's at the end, and there's nothing else. There's no more to come. It's almost like he is saying, unless something changes, unless something breaks that cycle, these stories could just keep coming. There's no end to this downward spiral of depravity. I read it as an appeal for what's needed. Israel needs a righteous judge. Israel needs a better deliverer. Israel needs a righteous king. It's become apparent that without a human king as a sort of mediator of the covenant, leading the people in righteousness, Israel's not going to uphold its vocation as a light to the nations. Now, if you've been watching Randy and Andrew's series, Thursday through Ruth, you know that that book, the very next one in the Bible, takes place right here in this society, in the same time frame as the Judges. And I'll let their series speak for itself, but they've shown one of the themes of Ruth is how at the end of the book, we see all of it as God's plan to raise up a man named David. So this cry for a king is going to be answered by David in the near term. But even he is a flawed deliverer. Ultimately, the godly king who brings righteousness is the person of Jesus Christ, God's Son. When he assumes the throne, the kingdom of God will be fully restored, and humanity will finally live under a righteous theocracy.